The old farmhouse stood at the end of a narrow, winding road, half hidden by the encroaching trees that cast long shadows over the gravel path. As Alex turned off the ignition, the sound of the car engine faded, leaving only the distant hum of crickets in the late afternoon. Megan stared out the window, her eyes locked on the house before them. It wasn't grand or sprawling, but it had an air of something ancient, something that had endured. "Feels like it's been here forever," Megan said, her voice soft with wonder and a hint of trepidation. Alex chuckled, running a hand through his messy hair as he stepped out of the car. "Well, according to the paperwork, it pretty much has." The farmhouse had been in Alex's family for generations, though it had long since passed out of immediate memory. A distant relative, an elderly aunt he'd never met, had left it to him in her will. The attorney's letter had come as a surprise, and the idea of inheriting a property in rural New England seemed more like a ghost story than real life. Still, they had come. Fresh air and solitude had appealed to them after the chaos of their lives in the city. Megan stepped out and stretched, taking in the sprawling field that bordered the house, the dense line of trees beyond it, and the sky tinged with the pink glow of a fading sun. Her gaze eventually settled on the house itself, peeling paint, sagging porch roof, and a fence that looked like it would give way at any moment. It was a fixer-upper, to say the least, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "It's beautiful," she said after a long pause. "Beautiful's a stretch," Alex replied, but he smiled, tugging at her hand as they moved toward the front door. "But it'll be ours." The inside of the house smelled like old wood and dust. Cobwebs stretched lazily across the high ceiling beams, and the floor creaked under their weight with every step. They explored the rooms slowly, taking in the antique furniture that had been left behind, the faded floral wallpaper that lined the walls, and the narrow staircase that led up to the second floor. "I didn't think it would come furnished," Megan remarked, brushing her fingers over an old wooden table in the dining room. Alex shrugged. "Guess no one's been here to clear it out. It's like a time capsule." They continued upstairs, finding a small bedroom with a high iron-framed bed and a tiny window overlooking the backyard. The glass was cloudy, but Megan could still make out the shape of an old stone well just beyond the tangle of trees. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment, but she quickly turned her attention back to Alex, who was fiddling with a loose board in the floor. "This place has some charm, right?" he asked, his voice light as he forced the board back into place. "I mean, sure, it's a little rough around the edges, but it could be something great." Megan smiled. "Yeah, I think it could." They spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking their few belongings and discussing renovation plans. By the time night had fallen, they were exhausted, and after a simple dinner of takeout they'd brought along, they collapsed into bed, the house silent around them. But sleep didn't come easily for Megan. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house as it settled in the night. There was something about the silence here, something too thick, too still, like the air was holding its breath. She glanced at the window, the glass reflecting the faintest sliver of moonlight. Then she heard it. At first it was so soft, she thought she might have imagined it. A low, whispering sound that seemed to drift through the open window. Megan strained her ears, holding her breath, waiting to hear it again. The wind rustled the leaves outside, but underneath it, there was something else. A murmur, words, a voice. Megan. Her heart thudded in her chest. She sat up slowly, her eyes fixed on the window. Had Alex called her name in his sleep? She turned to him, but he was snoring softly, his face relaxed in deep slumber. She turned back to the window, her pulse quickening. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "Megan." This time she was certain. It wasn't Alex, it wasn't her imagination. Someone or something was calling her name. She threw off the covers and slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of the moon outside. Slowly, she made her way to the window, her breath hitching as she approached. Outside, the trees swayed gently, casting long, crooked shadows across the yard. Her eyes were drawn to the well. The ancient stone structure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by overgrown grass and ivy that crept along its edges. The bucket hung motionless from the pulley, the rope frayed and old. It had been there for as long as the house, untouched, unused. "Megan, come closer." The voice was clearer now, though still faint, as if it were rising up from the depths of the earth itself. Megan pressed her hand to the window pane, her breath fogging the glass. The voice was coming from the well. Her blood ran cold. She wanted to look away, to close the window and crawl back into bed, but something held her there, rooted to the spot. The whispers, soft and insistent, called to her again. "Megan." She didn't know how long she stood there, staring out into the night, her hand resting on the window. The voice continued to murmur her name over and over, like a lullaby drifting on the wind. Finally, with trembling fingers, she pulled the curtains closed and stepped back. The whispers stopped, leaving only the quiet rustle of the leaves outside. Megan crawled back into bed, her heart racing, her mind swirling with questions. She closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. The voice lingered in her ears, haunting her, pulling at the edges of her thoughts. In the silence of the night, the well waited, and so did the whispers. The morning sunlight filtered through the small kitchen window, casting pale yellow light onto the worn wooden floor. Alex whistled a soft tune as he poured coffee into 2 mugs, the smell of fresh brew briefly chasing away the eerie stillness that had settled over the house. Megan sat at the small kitchen table, staring blankly at the steaming cup in front of her. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim, her thoughts far from the warmth of the room. "You didn't sleep well," Alex said, sitting across from her, concern etched on his face. "Nightmares?" Megan blinked, her eyes meeting his. She tried to smile, but the memory of the whisper still clung to her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. "Not exactly. I heard something last night." Alex raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his coffee. "Heard something?" Megan hesitated. The words seemed ridiculous when she tried to form them in her mind. Voices from a well? It was just the wind, right? "There were whispers," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper itself. "I swear I heard someone calling my name." From the well, Alex set his mug down with a soft clink, his face softening into a smile that carried a hint of disbelief. "Come on, Meg. It's an old house. You know how these places are. Creaky floors, drafts, probably just the wind." "I know what I heard," Megan insisted, her voice firmer this time. "It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, Alex, I'm sure of it." He frowned, looking at her with a mixture of concern and amusement. "You're not saying you actually believe those silly stories the townspeople told us, are you? About the well being cursed or haunted or whatever nonsense they were talking about?" Megan shook her head. "Number, I don't know what I'm saying. It felt real. Like someone was trying to get my attention." Alex reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We've been under a lot of stress with the move. It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you. Give it a few days and you'll feel more at home here." But Megan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something she needed to understand. By the afternoon, the unease had settled deeper into her bones. While Alex busied himself with fixing a broken window pane and clearing out the attic, Megan couldn't stop thinking about the well. The whispers gnawed at her, pulling her thoughts back to that stone structure in the yard. She had to know more. With a determined sigh, she grabbed her keys and decided to head into town. She didn't have a clear plan. but the nagging feeling inside told her there was something in this place's history that could explain what was happening. Maybe, just maybe, the whispers weren't as crazy as they seemed. The town's library was small, a modest brick building nestled between an antique shop and a bakery. Inside, it smelled of dust and yellowing paper, the shelves lined with aging books that seemed to have been forgotten long ago. Megan approached the front desk, where an elderly librarian with silver hair and thick glasses sat reading a faded hardcover. "Excuse me," Megan began, her voice tentative. "I'm looking for some information on the farmhouse just outside town, the one near the old well. It used to belong to the Harrington family, I think." The librarian's face paled slightly, and she lowered her book slowly, her gaze sharp and probing. "The Harrington place," she said, her voice low and almost reverent. "Haven't had anyone ask about that in years." Megan leaned forward, sensing the shift in tone. "Do you know anything about it? Or the well on the property?" The librarian hesitated, then pushed her chair back with a small creak and stood. "Follow me." She led Megan to a back corner of the library where the dim light barely reached. The shelves here were crammed with old ledgers, town records, and forgotten archives. The librarian began pulling down volumes, her fingers moving with surprising speed and familiarity through the dusty tomes. "That place has a history," the librarian said softly, laying a worn, leather-bound book in front of Megan. "People don't like to talk about it. The well, especially." Megan opened the book carefully, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The first few pages were dull, lists of property transactions and town ordinances. But then she turned the page and found something different, something dark. It was an account, handwritten, describing a series of strange disappearances that had occurred in the area over the course of more than 2 centuries. The first entry was from 1794. Sarah McNeil, age 8, disappeared after fetching water from the Harrington well. Search parties found no trace of her. The only sound near the well was the echo of her name, called faintly from its depths. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She turned the page and found more. 1842. Thomas Harding, a traveler passing through, was last seen stopping at the well for water. His horse was found tied to the post, but Thomas was never seen again. Witnesses claimed they heard strange voices near the well that evening. Each entry chilled her to the bone, stories of people who had vanished without a trace after visiting the well. Children, wanderers, even entire families who had lived on the land. The pattern was undeniable, stretching back through generations. And in every case there were whispers, voices that seemed to lure people to their doom. The librarian watched her in silence, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Megan flipped through the pages, her heart racing as she uncovered more and more. The last entry was dated 1910. Mary Harrington, last of the Harrington line, was found wandering near the well at dusk, muttering incoherently about voices calling to her from below. She was taken to an asylum, where she remained for the rest of her life. The well was sealed soon after. Megan leaned back, the weight of the story settling over her like a cold shroud. The well wasn't just a quaint old relic, it was tied to something dark, something malevolent. And whatever it was, it had been there for centuries, feeding on the souls of those who ventured too close. "Why wasn't this well known?" Megan asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why don't people talk about this?" The librarian gave a faint, sad smile. "Because the town has always been afraid. There's a belief that speaking of the well draws its attention. It's better to let the past lie undisturbed." Megan closed the book, her hands trembling slightly. She had always been a rational person, not one to believe in old wives' tales or ghost stories. But this was different. The The stories, the disappearances, they were too numerous, too consistent to be dismissed. As she left the library, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, Megan felt the weight of what she had discovered settle deep into her chest. The well wasn't just some forgotten relic. It was alive with secrets, with whispers, and with the souls of those it had claimed. She returned to the farmhouse, her mind racing, her heart pounding. And as she stood at the edge of the backyard, staring at the ancient stone well, she knew one thing for certain. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were only just beginning. Megan sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the smooth surface of the old, worn wood. The house was quiet, too quiet, save for the occasional groan of the floorboards settling or the distant creak of the old beams in the wind. The air inside felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of something ancient, something unseen. Alex had left early that morning to pick up supplies in town, leaving Megan alone in the house for the first time since they'd moved in. Her eyes drifted toward the backyard window, where the outline of the well was just visible through the thick trees and wild overgrowth. It had rained earlier, and now the grass glistened in the pale sunlight, but her gaze was fixed on the well as it had been for days. She had spent hours in the library over the past week, poring over records, piecing together the stories of the people who had disappeared. The voices. They had called to all of them, just as they had called to her. There was a pull in her chest, something that gnawed at the edges of her mind, whispering to her even when she tried to sleep. She knew Alex didn't believe her. He was kind, patient, but she could see the frustration building in him, the way he carefully avoided talking about the well now, as though doing so might only feed her fixation. He thought it was stress or exhaustion from the move, maybe even loneliness. But Megan knew better. She had stopped hearing the whispers only at night. Now, even during the day, the faint murmur of her name seemed to drift on the wind, rising and falling with the soft rustle of the trees outside. At first, she had tried to ignore it. She'd shut the windows, turned up the radio, distracted herself with chores, but nothing worked. The voices were always there, just out of reach. They were growing louder. That afternoon, she found herself standing at the edge of the well again, staring down into its dark depths. The old stone walls were damp from the rain, the moss glistening in the afternoon light. The bucket hung still, the rope frayed and brittle. She had convinced herself that she wouldn't get close again, that she wouldn't let herself be drawn to it. But here she was. The voices were stronger now, more distinct, though still faint, like the echo of distant memories. And they weren't just calling her name anymore. "We're here. Megan, we need you." She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, feeling the chill in the air despite the warmth of the afternoon. She wanted to look away, to turn and walk back to the house, but she couldn't. The pull was stronger today, insistent. Something beneath the surface was trying to communicate with her, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. "I know you're there," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't sure who or what she was speaking to, but the words tumbled out anyway. "What do you want from me?" The wind picked up slightly and the trees rustled in response. The voices swelled, overlapping now, whispering fragments of words she couldn't quite make out. But beneath the confusion, one message seemed clear. They needed her. When Alex returned later that evening, he found Megan sitting by the fireplace, staring into the low flames. She hadn't lit it for warmth. The day had been relatively mild, but the fire provided a distraction, something to focus on that wasn't the well. He set down the bags of groceries and knelt beside her. "Hey," he said softly, placing a hand on her arm. "How are you feeling?" She didn't respond immediately, her eyes still locked on the flickering flames. Finally, she turned to him, her expression distant, as though she had just returned from somewhere far away. "I'm fine," she said, though the words sounded hollow, even to her. Alex frowned, his gaze searching her face. "Are you sure? You've been different lately. Distracted." Megan sighed, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I don't expect you to believe me, Alex. I know how it sounds, but I can't shake the feeling that the well is trying to tell me something." Alex's jaw tightened and he sat back on his heels, frustration creeping into his voice. "Megan, it's an old well. It's not trying to tell you anything. You're obsessing over this and it's not healthy." "I've read the stories," she said quietly. "It's not just in my head. The people who disappeared, they all heard the same thing. Voices calling them, just like I've been hearing. I can't ignore it." He stood up, rubbing a hand over his face, clearly torn between concern and exasperation. "I don't know what you think you're going to find. We should be focusing on fixing this place up, making it our home. But every time I turn around, you're out there staring at that damn well." Megan flinched at his tone, her heart sinking. She knew he was trying to help, but he couldn't understand. "I can't explain it, Alex. I feel like something's wrong. Like there's something in that well, something trapped, and it needs me." Alex let out a frustrated sigh, pacing back and forth in front of the fire. "You need to let this go, Megan. It's consuming you. I barely recognize you anymore." The words stung, and Megan blinked back the tears that threatened to rise. She wanted to let it go for Alex's sake, for her own sanity. But every time she tried, the whispers pulled her back, and deep down she knew she was already in too deep to walk away. That night, as Alex slept fitfully beside her, Megan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but outside, the wind had picked up again, brushing against the window panes with soft sighs. She turned onto her side, pulling the covers tightly around her, but the whispers slipped through the cracks. "Megan, Megan, we need you." She closed her eyes, her pulse quickening. The voices were clearer now, no longer a distant hum, but distinct, urgent. They were calling her, pleading with her. She could almost see them, figures standing at the bottom of the well, their pale faces turned upward, their eyes locked on her. Her breath hitched, and before she could stop herself, she was slipping out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. Alex murmured something in his sleep, but didn't wake. Megan dressed quickly, throwing on a sweater and boots, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she was doing, only that she couldn't ignore the call any longer. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, biting at her skin as she made her way toward the well. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the yard, illuminating the ancient stone structure like a beacon. The whispers grew louder with each step, wrapping around her like a fog. "Come closer. Megan, we're here." Her hands trembled as she reached the well, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The bucket hung still, the rope swaying slightly in the wind. Megan peered over the edge, her eyes straining to see into the darkness below. The water was still, smooth as glass, reflecting the faint light of the moon. But beneath the surface, she saw them. Faces, pale, gaunt, their eyes wide with desperation, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Shadows swirled around them, twisting and shifting, but the faces remained, pressing closer to the surface, their voices rising into a frantic chorus. "Help us! Megan!" Her pulse thundered in her ears, her mind reeling. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The pull was too strong, and before she knew it, her hands were gripping the edge of the well, her body leaning over as though something inside was pulling her down. The voices surrounded her, filled her, and in that moment she knew there was no turning back. The wind had fallen silent, leaving the air unnervingly still. The night hung heavy over the farmhouse, its darkened windows staring out into the void like hollow eyes. A thin layer of mist curled through the yard, winding itself around the trees, the porch, and, most of all, the well. Megan stood at its edge, staring down into the unbroken blackness below. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, the cold biting at her skin, but she no longer felt it. She no longer felt anything but the pull. Behind her, the house was dark, quiet. Alex was asleep, safe, unaware of what was about to happen. She had slipped out of bed unnoticed, her heart pounding as she made her way through the silent rooms, grabbing only what she needed: a lantern, a length of rope, and the steady resolve that had been building inside her for days. Weeks, maybe. This was it. She had fought it for as long as she could, but the whispers had won. "Come, Megan, we need you." The voices were so clear now, louder than ever before. They no longer hovered at the edge of her consciousness. They had become part of her, intertwining with her very thoughts, drawing her inexorably toward the well. She hadn't told Alex. How could she? He wouldn't understand. He couldn't feel the urgency of the voices, the way they cried out for her, desperate and pleading. She had no choice now. She was their only hope. The rope was coiled at her feet, damp from the dew that clung to the earth. With trembling fingers, she tied one end to the old iron hook near the well's base, tugging it to test its strength. The other end she wrapped around her waist, securing it as best she could before grabbing the lantern and lowering it into the well. The dim light barely penetrated the inky blackness below. She couldn't see the water, but she could feel it, its cold presence rising up to meet her, calling her down. There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation as her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back. But the voices were too strong, their pull too relentless. Megan took one final, steadying breath and stepped over the edge. The air inside the well was damp and thick, pressing against her skin like a wet shroud as she slowly descended, her body swaying with the rope's tension. The lantern flickered, casting erratic shadows against the stone walls, which were slick with moss and moisture. Her feet dangled in the air, searching for purchase, but there was none. Just the endless drop beneath her and the whispers that guided her deeper into the darkness. Megan. Megan. She couldn't tell how far she had gone. Time seemed to stretch and warp as she sank lower and lower into the earth, the opening of the well growing smaller above her until it was little more than a pinprick of light. Her muscles ached from holding herself upright, her hands raw from gripping the rope. But the voices, those insistent, pleading voices, pushed her forward, blocking out the pain, the fear, everything. Suddenly, her feet touched something solid. Cold, slick stone. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had reached the bottom. She lifted the lantern, its weak light barely illuminating the space around her. The well was narrower here, the air colder. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and for a moment there was only silence. The voices had stopped. But then she saw them. They emerged from the shadows slowly, like figures rising from the depths of a forgotten dream. Their faces were pale, drawn tight with sorrow, their hollow eyes locked on hers. Children, women, men, all of them broken, worn by the weight of the years they had spent trapped here. Their mouths moved silently, though she could hear them clearly in her mind. Their voices filled the air, wrapping around her like a cold fog, pulling her closer to them. "Help us. Megan, free us." She stepped forward, her breath hitching as she moved toward the figures. The lantern trembled in her hand, casting flickering light across their faces, twisted in anguish. She could feel their pain, their desperation. They had been trapped here for so long, locked in the well's cold grasp, their souls bound to this place by some ancient unholy force. "I'll help you," Megan whispered, her voice shaking. "I'll set you free." But as she reached out, something cold and sharp wrapped around her wrist. She gasped, the lantern slipping from her hand and crashing to the stone floor, shattering the fragile light and plunging her into darkness. The figures surged toward her, their hands cold as death, pulling her into their midst. The whispers rose into a deafening chorus, their voices no longer pleading, but insistent, demanding. "We need you. We need you to stay with us." Megan struggled, her heart pounding in her chest as the cold hands tightened around her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, lost beneath the cacophony of voices. The rope around her waist went slack, and for a brief, dizzying moment she realized that she was falling. Alex awoke to the sound of silence. He reached for Megan, but his hand found only the cold emptiness of her side of the bed. He blinked, sitting up in the darkness, the fog of sleep lifting as he listened for any sign of her. Nothing. The house was eerily still, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind outside. "Megan," he called softly, his voice thick with sleep. No answer. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood, his stomach twisting with unease. He called her name again, louder this time, but the only response was the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. His heart quickened as he moved through the house, checking room after room, his voice growing more frantic. "Megan! Megan!" Panic began to creep into his chest as he reached the back door. It was unlocked, swinging open slightly, the cold night air seeping into the house. He stepped outside, his bare feet sinking into the damp grass. The mist curled around him, thick and oppressive. His eyes scanned the yard, searching for any sign of her. Then he saw it. The well stood at the far end of the yard, its stone walls glistening in the moonlight. The rope that had been coiled by its side was gone, dangling over the edge like a snake. His heart lurched into his throat and he ran. "Megan!" he shouted, his voice breaking as he skidded to a stop at the well's edge. He grabbed the rope, his hands trembling. "Megan, are you down there?" There was no answer, only the empty, deafening silence of the night. He pulled at the rope, but it came up quickly, too easily. Panic surged through him as the frayed end appeared in the moonlight, severed, as though something had cut it clean. His breath came in ragged gasps as he leaned over the edge, his eyes straining to see into the blackness below. "Megan!" His voice echoed off the stone walls, fading into the dark. But there was no response, no whispers, no trace of her at all. The well was sealed, its secret kept, as though it had never been opened, and Megan was gone. Weeks passed, but Alex never found her. The police searched the property, the town, the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of Megan. She had vanished like so many others before her, swallowed by the darkness that lived in the well. The house grew quiet after that, the air thick with loss. Alex couldn't bear to stay. He left the farmhouse behind, locking the doors and boarding the windows, hoping that it would keep the well's whispers at bay. But even as he drove away, he could still hear them, faint and far away, carried on the wind. The well remained as it always had, waiting for the next soul to answer its call. And in the stillness of the night, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear her voice. "Megan."